Hello, and welcome to United Astronomy Clubs of New Jersey. So while people are still filing down from getting parked, a couple things. Welcome everyone who is both here and on our live streams. That's right, we do live stream this every time we have a presentation on our YouTube and on Twitch. So if you ever can't make it here, or if you want to check out our winter programs, which are online only, you can always like and subscribe down on that YouTube. That being said, please do check us out on our website, uacnj.org. That's where you're going to find a list of all of our upcoming talks, as well as all about our member clubs, our scopes, and all sorts of other fun information. You can also check us out on our socials. So we have Facebook, Instagram, Discord, Twitter. I'm sure I'm missing one. I already went over the website. Someone was paying attention at least. And with that, we're going to get into tonight's program. So tonight is the life and legacy of William Herschel. And our presenter tonight is Bill Murray. Bill has been in a paper, behave. Finally, I got it to behave. Bill is an amateur astronomer for more than 50 years and has been employed as a software engineer and teacher, and is currently planetarium technician and lecturer at New Jersey State Planetarium in Trenton, right?
Right.
You're still there? Perfect. He has owned more than a dozen different telescopes and is a member of Amateur Astronomers Association of Princeton. After helping to build an observatory here at Jenny Jump, Bill was inspired to build one in his own backyard, which he uses frequently to observe his favorite astronomical artists. He is a volunteer observer for United Astronomy Clubs of New Jersey and helps out with our public programs throughout the year. And with that, we're going to give it to Bill.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight and braving the cold weather. So the topic of my talk tonight is the life and legacy of William Herschel. So who is William Herschel? He's an astronomer in the 18th century. He actually started out, he was not a professional astronomer. His career was a musician, and he was an amateur astronomer, which recommends him to me. And so I'd like to inform you about his life and his work, and why I think he's the most my favorite astronomer in the history of astronomy. And I've studied astronomy now for a long, long time. So Herschel was born in 1738 in the electorate of Hanover, which is now part of Germany. At that time, it was part of the Holy Roman Empire. The king of Hanover, kind of strangely, was George II, who was the king of Britain. He was actually became king of Britain after he was already king of Hanover, and so he ruled both of those countries. Herschel's father, Isaac, was a musician in the Hanoverian army. Back then, armies had bands for cadence marching with the soldiers, and it was an important part of the army. And his father was a musician, and Herschel followed in his father's steps and was also a musician and joined the Hanoverian army as well. In the year 1757, the Hanoverian army was badly defeated, and Isaac Herschel recommended that both William and his other son Jacob leave Germany and emigrate to Britain. In order to do that, Herschel had to actually desert from the army in order to get out of it, which is probably a good thing for the history of astronomy, because also in that year, the 7 Years' War began, which was a major world war, really the first world war that had ever been. Over here in America, we know it as the French and Indian War, and North America was one of the major theaters of the war, but it was certainly much wider than that. It was fought all over Europe, across all the oceans of the world, in India and Africa as well, with, after 7 years, Britain coming out on top. But since Herschel got out of the army and became a civilian again, he missed all of that. He was a musician by trade, and when he emigrated to England, he acted as a teacher of music. That was his main job. But he also composed symphonies on the side. And now if you do a little bit of searching on the internet, you can actually find orchestras that have recorded his symphonies on CD as well. Okay. In the year 1766, he moved to the city of Bath in England. At that time, Bath was a major resort town. A lot of the upper crust in England used to vacation there, similar to what, say, Palm Beach is today. And Herschel acted as a music teacher there. And he also started to become acquainted with some people in the nobility of England because he was teaching their children music. His house in Bath is still in existence, and it's now been converted into a museum devoted to Herschel. This is its location in Bath, and you can also see some of the restored artifacts here. His living room with small telescope and globe, and one of the telescopes that he manufactured himself. He was, in addition to being an astronomer, he was a major creator of telescopes. Which at that time was necessary because you couldn't buy telescopes commercially. If you wanted one, you had to make it yourself. So when he was working in Bath, he met the violinist John Mitchell, who was a former professor of mathematics at Cambridge. And Mitchell was the one who first introduced him to astronomy, and he got the astronomy bug from him. He also became acquainted with Neville Maskelyne, who was the Astronomer Royal, the main astronomer for the British Navy. And from Maskelyne, Herschel learned about the current topics of interest in astronomy, and he decided to take up astronomy as a hobby. So he was an amateur, like all of us here, and began to make his own telescopes, and he quickly developed a passion for both doing astronomy and making telescopes. He would teach his music lessons, and as soon as he was done, he would hurry on home so that he could take his telescopes out in the backyard, similar to what we do here, and start observing the skies. In the year 1772, he was joined by his sister, Carolyn Herschel. She moved from Germany to Bath, and when she came into Herschel's house, she acted as his secretary and also his assistant in his astronomy activities. Okay? So back in the 18th century, astronomy was very different than it is today. Most professional astronomers in Europe, and that's where virtually all of them were, there were a few in America, but not very many. So virtually all professional astronomers in Europe used their telescopes to observe the moon and the planets and comets. That was pretty much it. And the main reason why is if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In the 18th century, astronomers thought they understood planets and moons and comets pretty well. They used small refracting telescopes, similar to telescopes you could buy for less than $100 today. Not very good quality, even back then. And so they were really only suited for viewing objects that were fairly close and very bright, like the moon and the planets. Refracting telescopes are the kind of telescopes that you think about when you hear the word telescope. So there's a lens in front that focuses the image, and then another lens in back called the eyepiece that magnifies it so you can look at it. Refractors have the disadvantage that you can only make them so large. Eventually, if you start making larger and larger refractors, the lens is only supported around the edges. And glass is a fluid, so that means that it starts to sag under its own weight as the lenses get bigger and bigger. The largest refractor that was ever built was one that had a diameter of 40 inches. It's at the Yerkes Observatory in Wisconsin. Refractors are the type of telescopes that Galileo first used to observe the moon and the planets and begin the revolution in astronomy that began in the 17th century, about 100 years before Herschel's time. And just a few years prior to when Herschel became interested in astronomy, this gentleman, who was the topic of my talk earlier in the spring, a Frenchman named Charles Messier, began observing at the Paris Observatory. Like all other professional astronomers, Messier was interested in the moon and the planets, but he was especially interested in finding comets, and he was very good at it. He found 15 comets on his own. He won a medal from the King of France, who called him the ferret of comets. But as Messier searched the night skies for comets from the roof of the Paris Observatory, he would occasionally come across small fuzzy patches in the night sky that looked like comets initially, but didn't move. Comets eventually move through the night sky and disappear. He called these objects nebula, which is the Latin word for cloud. They look like little cloudy spots in his telescope. He didn't know what they were, but he knew they weren't comets, and after finding a number of these objects, he became irritated because they were interfering with his comet searches. So he decided to save future comet hunters the trouble of running over them again by making a list of all of these objects that he found and publishing them in French scientific journals. Eventually, he found about 110 of these objects, and the irony is now, 200 years later, nobody really remembers any of the comets Messier found. They remember him for this list of nuisance objects, which turns out to be some of the best and brightest deep sky objects that you can see in the night sky. We'll talk about what deep sky objects are a little bit later in my talk. But refracting telescopes weren't the only type of telescope that was available. Also, about 70 or 80 years before Herschel's time, the English polymath genius Isaac Newton, who was most famous for devising the law of gravity, revolutionizing physics, and other major scientific achievements, decided that there had to be a way to make a telescope other than using lenses. And he created a type of telescope that used mirrors. And that type of telescope now is named after him. It's called the Newtonian reflector. This is an actual picture of the telescope that Newton made in the library of Cambridge Observatory. It's still around. So rather than using lenses to focus the light, Newtonian reflectors use a main mirror at the back that's curved. And that will focus the light and send it towards the front of the tube of the telescope, where a small secondary mirror directs the light off to the side where it's viewable through an eyepiece. The thing about reflectors is, since the whole mirror is supported on the back, you can make them as big as you want. And one of the things that Herschel did was he started making bigger and bigger reflectors to view objects in the nighttime sky. This is actually a picture of one of Herschel's telescopes at his house in Bath. This is his 7-foot telescope. Back then, telescopes were named using the focal length of the telescope, so that's the length of the light path in the telescope. Nowadays, we tend to name telescopes more by the aperture. Both of those are pretty much interchangeable. And this telescope has a diameter probably of about 6 inches. And it is of a design where the mount is altitude and azimuth. So the telescope will move up and down and around in a circle to point at things in the night sky. We still have telescopes like that today. As a matter of fact, after the talk is over with today, and I put my computer away, you're welcome to come around the house here. You'll see there's a small concrete pad. I have one of my telescopes set up over there, which is a design similar to that. It's also a reflector on an Altaz mount. And we'll take a look. We're going to be fighting the moonlight, but we'll still try to take a look at some of the objects that Herschel observed in his lifetime. So the most important aspect of any telescope is the aperture of the main lens or mirror. The reason why is you can think about telescopes as light buckets. The more light that you let in, the brighter the image will seem. And so the light gathering power of a telescope is proportional to the area of the mirror or lens. So the bigger mirror or lens you have, the more light you get through. Okay? And that's important because the more light you get through, the brighter objects seem. And most of the things that astronomers are looking at in the night sky are very, very dim. And you need to get as much light as possible. So on the left and right here are two different telescopes. The one on the left is 100 millimeter aperture, about 4 inches. Okay? And it's pointed at a galaxy. And you can see some parts of the galaxy. You can see the center fairly well. You can see some of the structure. But in the telescope on the right, which is 250 millimeters aperture, 10 inches, you get a lot better view. Okay, so the bigger the telescope, the better. Herschel took that idea to heart. Okay? But in his time, making a reflecting telescope was not that easy. Nowadays, reflecting telescopes are made by grinding glass, and then eventually when you grind it to a smooth enough surface, you can coat it with aluminum or silver. That's a very good solution. That sort of process will last a long time. They hadn't invented that process in the 18th century. So what they did was they used mirrors made of speculum, which was a combination of tin and copper. And Herschel became very adept at grinding his own mirrors and polishing them. The problem with speculum metal is that it tarnishes very, very rapidly. So Herschel would get into the grind of making a mirror, polishing it, putting it in one of his telescopes, and maybe 3 or 4 months later he'd have to pull it out and repolish it because it had become too tarnished. And so he always was interchanging mirrors in his telescope continually so that he had good optics for his astronomical observations. This is what a polished speculum mirror looks like. About 80% reflective, which wasn't bad for the 18th century. Nowadays, with metal on glass, you can get upwards of over 95% reflectivity. So the telescopes today will actually show you a lot more than a similar sized telescope would in the 18th century. As I said, Herschel became very adept at making his own mirrors. He split his time between making mirrors and doing observations. In this picture, he's shown here grinding a mirror in his house, and he didn't want to get interrupted in that activity by doing something as mundane as eating. So he would have his sister come and bring him food, and as he grinded the mirror, she would feed him. Okay? So he didn't have to interrupt his work. This is a picture of the basement in Herschel's house, which is where he made his mirrors. So there's a forge there. He would actually melt copper and tin into a molten conglomeration and pour it into molds and wait for that to cool. And then once it had cooled, he'd take those metal discs and then polish them into mirrors. You can see here that the floor there, the tiles are kind of cracked. You might think that's just through age. It's not. Several times Herschel was making these mirrors and he was moving the molten mixture in its forms, and he dropped it. And he ended up with molten metal all over his floor. That cracked the tiles. So that's why the floor looks the way it does there. This is the backyard of Herschel's house in Bath. This is where he did all his observations. So he'd bring his telescopes out into the backyard and start doing observations there as soon as he finished his day jobs. And had his sister out there, and she was acting to record the things that he was seeing through his telescopes. So Herschel was very unusual. As I said, back in the 18th century, most astronomers were concerned with the moon and the planets and comets. Herschel observed those things, but he was interested in seeing everything he could in the night sky. And so the objects, for instance, that Messier ignored and were just interfering with his comet searches, Herschel was trying to find as many of those as possible. And really, he was the only astronomer in the world who was doing this at the time. And he had the best tools to do it because he made considerably larger reflectors. He would make telescopes of 6, 10, 8-inch apertures, which were probably the biggest telescopes that anybody was using in the world at that time. And after doing his observations for a number of years as an amateur, he finally had an extremely good piece of luck. In the year 1781, March 13th of that year, he became the first person since antiquity to discover a major planet in our solar system when he found the planet Uranus, and that made him famous. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So what are the other things that Herschel was doing with his telescopes? He was looking at double stars. So astronomers had the idea that double stars that you see in the night sky, when you look at them in the telescope, they're two stars that are very close together. They had to be two stars that looked close together because of our point of view here on the Earth, but were actually vast distances away from each other. And they thought if that was the case, then you should be able to use parallax to determine how far those stars are away from each other. So if you go through this exercise, if you take your finger and hold it about 2 or 3 feet in front of your face, and then close one eye, and then switch it and close and open the other eye, you can see that the finger appears to move against the background. That's called parallax. And that's what astronomers were trying to do with stars. Only instead of the distance between your two eyes, what they were doing is observing the star when the Earth is at one point in its orbit during the summer, and then again during the winter. And then the distance between those two observations would be the diameter of the Earth's orbit. And they thought that by doing that, they could see the stars change position, and they'd be able to use mathematics to be able to figure out the distance of the stars. Herschel was doing that too. Okay, he used his telescopes to look at many, many double stars, but he was never able to discover any parallax in any of the measurements that he made. And this indicated to him that the double stars actually weren't far away from each other in space, they were close together. So that they were actually stars that were orbiting around each other. And so that observation by Herschel was the first demonstration that Newtonian physics, which describes the orbits of things around each other, actually worked outside our solar system at other places in the universe. Here's a picture of Herschel observing with his telescope in his backyard, his sister in the background taking notes as he would call out his observations to her. This is the telescope that he used, his own design. And as I said, in March of 1781, he discovered the planet Uranus. And this is kind of what Uranus looks like in a telescope even today. It looks like a small blue-green dot. Okay. Originally, when he discovered it, Herschel thought it was a comet. But he followed it for a number of days and weeks, and saw that it was moving, but it was moving very slowly. So he was unsure whether it was a comet or something else. And when he talked to the people who he knew in Bath who were interested in astronomy, Maskelyne in particular, the Astronomer Royal, and told him about this discovery, other people in England observed the same object, and they were able to do calculations of its orbit and determine that it was a planet and not a comet. Okay? When this happened, Herschel became famous throughout Europe as the first person in history to actually discover a major planet in our solar system. And people said, of course, okay, you've made this magnificent discovery. What are you going to call your new planet? And Herschel thought about it for a little bit, and in an inspired piece of PR, he said, we will name the new planet Georgium Sidus, which is Latin for George's star. The George being King George III of England, the current King of England at the time. Now, in America, George III doesn't have a good reputation because he was the English king who the American revolutionaries were revolting against. But in England, he was much better thought of. And he was a major patron of the sciences in England. Not only astronomy, but also physics and biology and mathematics made major contributions to the financial support of many scientists in England. And hearing that Herschel had decided to name this new planet after him really put Herschel in a good light with the king. So King George was impressed by Herschel's discovery and decided to name him the King's Astronomer. So Herschel became the personal astronomer of the King of England. Could at this point afford to give up his day job with a salary of £200, which was nothing to sneeze at back in the 18th century. He could devote himself completely to astronomy. King George also, still being the King of Hanover, granted him a pardon for his decamping from the Hanoverian army all those years before. And he also gave him £500 to begin construction of the largest telescope in the world. And that was the main telescope that Herschel used for many years, his 20-foot telescope, which actually had a diameter of the mirror of about 18 inches. And you see here that as you get bigger and bigger telescopes, the structure to support them becomes more intense. So it's an Altaz mount. So with pulleys, you can raise the telescope up and down. It's on a Lazy Susan type dolly, so you can turn it around as well. Herschel in his observations generally didn't turn his telescopes in azimuth. That was too cumbersome. So what he would do is he would bring the telescope out and point it at the north-south line, the meridian. And he would just observe a point in the sky, and as the night passed, objects would move into his field of view and out of them. And he would record the time that he saw it, call out his observation to Carolyn, who would record it in writing, with the time he discovered it and a description of what the object looked like. And like Messier, Herschel began to discover a lot of these deep sky objects. Whereas Messier had found 100 or so with his small telescope, Herschel started finding hundreds and then thousands of them with this much, much larger telescope that he was using. Okay? So in the year 1786, Herschel moved to the town of Slough, which was near Windsor Castle, to act as the king's personal astronomer. He built a residence there, which was later called Observatory House. It was still in existence as late as the 1950s. This is a picture from the early 20th century. However, late 1950s, 1960s, the house had become kind of derelict, and it was torn down, and I think they put up a housing development where it was, which is unfortunate. So, as Herschel was surveying the night sky, what were some of the things that he was finding? So, he was finding many of these nebula, and like other astronomers before him, he didn't know what they were. But he decided that he would record all of them and record his observations of them, what they look like, where they were located in the night sky, and that future astronomers could piece together that mystery. Okay. So the nebulae turn out to be a bunch of different types of objects. Some of them are galaxies, as is the picture on the left, other star systems besides our Milky Way. and some of them are actually objects that are in our Milky Way. So Herschel became obsessed with finding these objects, and in the year 1785 he petitioned the king again to give him more funds to create, for the second time, the largest telescope in the world. And this time he outdid himself. He created a telescope with an aperture of 48 inches and a focal length of 40 feet. And from the year 1785 all the way up until 1845, this was the largest telescope in the world, Herschel's 40-foot telescope, which no longer exists today. Just a portion of the tube can still be seen at the Greenwich Observatory. The mirror is gone. Most of the structure that supported it is gone. But Herschel used this telescope and was able to find thousands more of these deep sky objects using this telescope. Okay. So after 20 years of observing, Herschel had discovered about 2,500 of these nebula, and all the nebula that were visible in his telescopes from the latitude of England. So what are these objects? We know today what they are. Some of them are diffuse or gaseous nebula. So these are clouds of gas and dust in our galaxy. They're places where stars are born. So in these clouds, sometimes parts of the cloud will become a little bit more dense than others. And when that happens, the gravity from that dense area begins to pull in other mass from other parts excuse me, of the cloud. And as this happens, those areas become denser and hotter, and eventually they become dense and hot enough that nuclear reactions start and stars are born. So you see here in this picture of the Cone Nebula, NGC 2264, discovered by Herschel, that the gas is being illuminated by these very young stars. Most of those stars that you see have just been born out of that cloud. They're only about 10 to 20,000 years old. So that sounds old to us, but stars can live for millions or even billions of years. So a star that's only 10,000 years old isn't even out of the celestial maternity ward yet. There are also star clusters. This is another one of Herschel's discoveries, NGC 188. So in these clouds of gas and dust, eventually so many stars form that the radiation from those stars blows away the remaining gas and dust, and star formation stops. What happens then is you're left with a cluster of a few hundred young stars, as we see here. There are many of these clusters in the galaxy. We'll take a look at a couple of them tonight. There are also globular clusters. These are also clusters of stars, but very different than open clusters. So globular clusters contain up to 500,000 to 1,000,000 stars, and instead of being young, they're very old. Scientists are still not 100% sure how they form, but there are about 150 of these globular clusters excuse me, orbiting around the center of our Milky Way galaxy. Messier had discovered about a dozen or so of them. Herschel discovered a few hundred more. There are also planetary nebula. The term planetary nebula doesn't have anything to do with planets, but we owe Herschel that name. So he discovered a bunch of these objects, and to him and his telescope, they kind of look like dim versions of Uranus and some of the other planets like Jupiter or Saturn. He didn't know what they were, but he said, okay, they kind of look like planets, so we'll call them planetary nebula. And even though they don't have anything to do with planets, the name stuck, and that's still what we call them today. What these are actually stars like our sun that are in the process of dying. So when a star like our sun, which is a relatively small star, becomes old, it uses up most of its hydrogen fuel and becomes unstable and then begins to pulsate. And as it does that, it throws off most of the gas remaining in the star into a cloud that expands out from the star, and that cloud is illuminated by the dead core of the star called a white dwarf. So that's what we're seeing here. These planetary nebulae usually only last for a few tens of thousands of years before the cloud dissipates, and then what you're left with is the dying core of the star, a white dwarf. And then there are galaxies. Herschel was finding thousands and thousands of these galaxies. up until the 20th century, astronomers really didn't know what these objects were. They thought they were objects in our Milky Way, but it turned out, and this was only discovered at the beginning of the 20th century, that they're completely separate galaxies other than our Milky Way, some tens of or hundreds of thousands of light years away from us. And they go out to the edge of the universe. So another thing that Herschel did, because he was taking surveys not only of these deep sky objects but stars, and he began to have a very good idea of the distribution of stars in our galaxy, the Milky Way. So after many years of observing, he started making some educated guesses about the distances of stars. He didn't really know exactly, but he was able to make some fairly good guesses. And what he decided to do was make a map of what he thought the Milky Way looked like. Since we're sitting inside of it, it's hard to see its structure. And so this is the map that he created. So he said the Milky Way had to be this flattened disk, rounded disk of stars. He put the sun a little bit too close to the center of that disk. It's actually a bit further out, but other than that, fairly accurate. So Herschel was the first person to actually have any idea of what the structure of the Milky Way was. Okay. Herschel married in 1788, and initially there was tension between his sister Caroline and his new wife, but that eased when Herschel's son John was born. And Carolyn became devoted to her nephew and acted as his tutor, and while she was also acting as William's astronomy assistant as well. So Herschel is at this point a major astronomer in Europe. He's made many signal discoveries, communicated those to the astronomy community, but he also made several major discoveries in physics as well. So he was actually the first person to discover a form of radiation other than light. And he did that by a very interesting experiment. It had been known for centuries that if you shine white light on a prism, the prism will separate it into a colored spectrum, like this. If you're kind of like my age and you take a look at this picture, you say, oh, dark side of the moon. Another astronomy reference. Okay. So what Herschel did, something very simple, but something that hadn't been done before. He took the light that was spread out from a spectrum and put thermometers on each of the colors and tried to see if there was a temperature difference between each of the colors of the light in the spectrum. He didn't find any difference in the colored band of the spectrum, but then he made the guess that he put a thermometer outside the colored band, and the one that is just beyond the red, he noticed that that had a higher temperature than the others did. And so he surmised that there was an invisible form of radiation that was there that actually had a higher temperature than others, and we now call that form of infrared radiation. So some of the things that Herschel had done during his life. He discovered the true nature of binary stars, discovered the planet Uranus, discovered Titania and Oberon, which were the moons, largest moons of the planet Uranus, discovered Mimas and Enceladus, which are moons of Saturn, discovered the true shape of our galaxy, discovered and cataloged thousands of nebula, discovered infrared radiation, and built the largest telescope in the world twice. Okay, not bad for an amateur astronomer. So he started life as a musician with astronomy as a hobby. At the end of his life, he was the greatest astronomer in the world. Okay. He won the Copley Medal and was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society. He was elected as a foreign member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1788, 5 years after the American Revolution ended, which was kind of unusual that the Americans would honor an Englishman that way. He was knighted by King George in 1816 and was a founding member and first president of the Royal Astronomical Society in 1820. He died at his observatory house in Slough in 1822 at the ripe old age of 83. He's buried in St. Laura's Church there, and his epitaph is, if I can hopefully pronounce this right, Coliorum perruptit claustra, which translates from the Latin as he broke through the barriers of the heavens. Very true. Okay. So what is his legacy? Okay. For someone who began his career as an amateur astronomer, Herschel left a series of discoveries and accomplishments unmatched in the history of astronomy. But his legacy continued with his other family members. So his sister Caroline, who was his devoted assistant for many years, he actually made a telescope for her that she began to use, and she began to do her own astronomical observations. And she became a very accomplished astronomer in her own right. She discovered 8 comets by herself. She was the first woman to discover a comet and the most prolific female comet discoverer until the 1980s. She discovered 14 nebulae. She received a salary of £50 from King George for astronomical work with William. That made her the first paid female public servant in English history. And she was awarded the Gold Medal of the Royal Astronomical Society, first woman to be named an honorary member of the Royal Astronomical Society, and won a gold medal from the King of Prussia. Okay. One of the nebulas that she discovered, NGC 7781, called Caroline's Rose, after her. And that may be one of the objects. We're going to be fighting the moonlight, but that's one of the objects I'm going to try to observe tonight. Okay. But Herschel's son also became a very famous astronomer as well. He was a noted mathematician and chemist and inventor. And from the years 1833 to 1838, he took his father's 20-foot telescope, not the largest telescope, the 40-foot one, but the second largest, on a voyage to South Africa to continue William's observations from the southern hemisphere, and discovered thousands of nebula down there as well. This is a drawing of Herschel's 20-foot telescope set up by John at Table Mountain in South Africa. So John discovered more than 1,700 nebulae in South Africa with his father's 20-foot telescope. He combined with these discoveries with those of his father and aunt and published what was called the General Catalogue of Nebula and Clusters of Stars in 1864. In 1878, the Danish-Irish astronomer J.L.E. Dreyer took Herschel's catalog, reordered it, combined it with some of the other discoveries made by other 18th century and 19th century astronomers, and published it as the New General Catalog, also known as the NGC. That's where the NGC numbers come from. Okay. So in addition, Dreyer also published in 1895 and 1908 the 2 index catalogs, which were additional discoveries that hadn't gone into the original New General Catalog. Together, they added a total of 5,836 deep sky objects to the catalogs for a total of 13,676 objects for a lifetime of observing. So there's many, many things you can see out there with small telescopes. Most of the entries in Herschel's catalog are dim objects, and many of amateur astronomers, when they start observing deep sky objects, they do something called a Messier marathon, trying to observe all of the objects that Charles Messier saw, the 100 objects or so, in a single night, usually in March or April. But there's also a similar thing for the objects discovered by Herschel called the Herschel 400. So the best and brightest of Herschel's discoveries have been grouped together in 400 objects, and many amateur astronomers try to challenge themselves after finding all of the objects found by Messier by going through the Herschel 400. I have seen all the Messier objects personally, but have not finished the Herschel 400 yet. Sometime I will, possibly after I retire. And that's it for my talk. Thank you for coming. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them for you.
Sorry. All right. Thank you, Bill, for a great talk. We are having a Q&A. Just before we get quite into that, just some safety notes, because I know some people are going to be antsy and want to get on the telescopes. When we go to leave, we are using our headlights. We do not like getting run over. We do not want to run anyone over. If you do, off the property. No, don't run people over. Uh, do not take that seriously. That is bad advice. That being said, if you have need, the moon's really bright, so seeing to get around is great right now. If you do happen to need to take out a flashlight or something, do keep it pointed towards the ground. Because as much as, yes, the headlights are large and blinding, we don't need small lights flashing in anyone's eyes for no reason. Right. So, if you need the bathroom, we do have the porta potty to my right, your left. We also have a gift shop and museum display area set up, and I will be in there after the Q&A. So how's this going to work? If you guys have questions out there, when I call for them, you're going to raise your hand and then wave it about, because I'm kind of blind because I've been looking at a screen for far too long. So yay, night blindness. But let's get this started off with a question from our online audience, which is, when making telescopes, do things scale linearly? Like, if you can make a small one, then you can also make a stupidly large one.
The general rule of thumb, if you become a telescope maker, and I've only dabbled in that myself, is that it's a lot easier to grind, say, a 6-inch mirror than a 10-inch mirror. The math and skills that you need to do a 10-inch mirror are much greater, and the general kind of wisdom is, if you want to make a 10-inch mirror, make a 6-inch mirror first. You'll learn enough there that making a 10-inch will become more possible.
Yeah. Also, one of our member clubs, NWJAA, they had gotten the largest privately owned telescope east of the Mississippi, and they found out some things, that if you go from making some nice small telescopes to making one absurdly large, like 50 inches across, sometimes things don't work out quite the same way as in the small telescopes, such as bracing big mirrors. But on that note, audience, do you have a question? Oh, there we are. Yep. Oh, there you are.
That's it. When did the name change for the planet Uranus? When did it change from George, whatever you said it was, to Uranus? And how did it get that particular name?
People in England were very happy with the name George's star, but people in the rest of Europe weren't too thrilled with it. So over the next 20 years or so, astronomers in Europe began to push that the planet be renamed according to the scheme that it was currently used, which was named after the Roman versions of the Greek gods. So eventually, in the early 19th century, the name that was used for the planet became Uranus as opposed to George's star.
All right. The next online question is, you talked about how Herschel had made the largest telescopes back then. There's got to be larger now. What is the current largest visual telescope on record?
So that is a good question. I believe currently it's the 10-meter telescope in Keck, the Keck telescope in Hawaii, but it's soon to be replaced because they're in construction now. Telescopes in South America that have a diameter of 30 meters, and so you can imagine a mirror that's a third of a football field across. And when that's completed, that will be the largest telescope that was ever made. It's for imaging. Telescopes these days, astronomers don't use telescopes visually anymore. They do imaging with them with sophisticated instruments.
Yeah, I just figured should probably they probably figured, because we know, like, James Webb works in the IR. We had that whole array of telescopes working together, and radio telescopes that was the size of the Earth, which is about probably the largest we can currently go. But that's probably why they clarified that. Okay, I know there was someone else who raised their hand.
Okay, so if you could have only one telescope for the rest of your life, what telescope would you choose and why?
Oh, that is such a loaded question.
Dun dun
Because
dun.
I've been doing astronomy now for 50 years, and I've kind of gotten it down to about 5 telescopes. And I don't know if I would actually have it in my heart to eliminate any one of them. I've done a very long culling project, and I use each of them for different things, and they're all pretty optimal. So I would say, don't ask me to pick the best one, but if you say I pick the best half dozen, yeah, I could do that.
And there's a lesson in that not all telescopes are good for all things. Depending on what you want to do, depends on the type of telescope you might choose. So that's an excellent point you brought up. Right, so our next online question was, do we know how many objects are currently found or named?
Billions and billions. I always wanted to say that in astronomy talk. The telescopes these days are much, much larger than the telescopes that Herschel used. And the cameras that we use today for astronomical imaging are much more sensitive than his eyes were. So astronomers have discovered many billions of objects in the night sky. The naming conventions become a little bit strange when you have that many. So most of those objects don't have names like Carolyn's rose or the double cluster, which is another object we'll try to look at tonight. They have numerical designations and in computer catalogs. But astronomers know now of, I would say, at least 200 or 300 million galaxies in the night sky that have been individually observed.
All right, our next question is here.
Why did you start astronomy?
So that's a good question. So I'm old enough that I actually remember when the Apollo 11 mission landed on the moon. I was 11 years old then, and that got me hooked onto astronomy. And I started doing astronomy as a hobby back in the early 1970s, and I've been doing it pretty much ever since.
Please keep it pointing. Right. Just putting out a call on our online if they have any questions. Do we have another question from our audience here? Again, you might have to raise your hand and wave it about because I look at screens and then I lose all night vision. Bueller? Anyone? We don't even have the crickets tonight that we normally do. Right. So I know we're a bit chilly. We do have a number of observatories open as well as observers with telescopes on the field. I ask that if you do go up to a person with a telescope on the field, you ask before just touching. A lot of these telescopes do take a bit of setup and alignment, so we want to avoid having to make them set up and align again. I know, like, not everything's like, I think you have your Dob out, yep, where it's very nice. You kind of just set it and just point, and you're good.
Well, it's not quite that easy, but close.
It's a lot better than
Yes.
James's setup, which involves a 30-step process that I've yet to see take less than an hour. But anyhow, any last-minute questions before we? Oh, perfect.
The Webb telescope is starting to show us the end of the universe, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Which I believe, from everything I ever know, which isn't much, that it was all caused by the Big Bang Theory. So how do we know there's not another Big Bang Theory that's happening outside our universe?
Short answer, we don't. So the Webb telescope will allow us to see back to what's called the recombination, which was when the first elements were created, the first hydrogen. Before that, basically the universe was just a sea of energy from the Big Bang. We can only see out to the edges of the universe and back to the beginning of the universe, but there are many scientific theories that posit that there are other universes around undergoing the same sort of changes that we have, maybe an infinite number, but we can't see them or interact with them, so we don't know if they're there. Yeah, I mean, eventually they may be able to determine whether our universe is interacting with another one, but with the level of equipment that we have now, we can't determine.
We don't know what we don't know until we know what we don't know. To make it really confusing. Right. We, like I said, we do have a number of observatories open. I know the Greenwood in the back is open. I think we have the Bunis and the one with the astrophysics that I always forget whether it's the Brady or the...
That's Brady, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Because all three of them have B's in
Yes.
the names, and I always misplace which one's which. Right. So with that, you guys have a good night. Like I said, I will be in the gift shop museum area if you want. Thank you, everyone who's online
you.
and here.